In the past, she could and did remove people's oath of allegiance to their sovereign leader, so that they were freed from their allegiance to the civil power if the civil power did not obey them. Such was her power. And since the 20th century, we have seen a strategy that is quite similar to the preparation in which she prepared for those centuries of torture and of persecution. And so we have a pattern. Just as before she got many kings and princes to sign on to her legal agreements, so particularly in the 20th century and in her own century, the 21st, she is again very strong in her bringing in her power through the civil law of nations. She does this primarily by what is called a concordat. A concordat is a civil agreement made between the Vatican and any particular nation. It guarantees the Roman Catholic Church with the right and freedom of her type of worship. It includes defining of things like doctrine, the establishing of Roman Catholic education and hospitals. It includes property rights, appointing of bishops, and the recognition of the Catholic law over marriage, particularly of the Catholic annulment. Such agreements have been made in the 20th century, and some of them really famous. Concordats in Latvia, 1922, Bavaria, 1924, Poland, 1925, Romania, 1927, Lithuania, 1927, Italy, the famous one with Mussolini, 1929, Baden, 1932, Austria, 1933, Germany, the same year, 1933, and Yugoslavia, 1935. The Vatican has preferred to do its civil agreements with its own dictators who are also Roman Catholic. And some of the most famous Vatican concordats or civil agreements have been made between the Vatican and dictators, for the most part whom were despots, who ruled Catholic nations. And I'd like to give you some of the more famous of these. Those who were Roman Catholic of the Catholic's own fold, that the Catholic did civil agreements with. Adolf Hitler in Germany from 1933 to 1945. Benito Mussolini in Italy from 1922 to 1943. Francisco Franco in Spain from 1936 to 1975. Antonio Salazar in Portugal from 1932 to 1968. Juan Perón in Argentina from 1946 to 1955. And Ante Pavelic in Croatia from 1941 to 1945. Each one of those nations has horrors all of its own. What happened through these civil concordats in the 20th century? It wasn't simply the millions of Jews, but the believers that suffered also under Hitler. And what the believers suffered under Franco and Mussolini, and probably the most gruesome torture to believers and to the Orthodox in Croatia has been some of the more horrific massacres and torture ever known on planet Earth under the civil agreements that the Roman Catholic Church had with Ante-Pavlik in Croatia. Make your stomach turn even to read of them. The Vatican is also involved in multilateral diplomacy, that is, relationships with governmental organizations that are not nations, and there are many of these. She has influence and official position with the United Nations and its agencies, the Council of Europe, the European Communities, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the Organization of American States, and such as the Organization of African Unity. They're just the principal governmental agencies where she has strong influence. She also participates in a long list of international, intergovernmental organizations, and it would take me about a half an hour to read out the whole list. Immense amount of organizations such as the Unification of Private Law, International Council on Grain, communications by satellite, and many other agencies where you would never expect that the Vatican is involved in. She has a foothold not just in governmental agencies but intergovernmental organizations. It was prior to 1989 that the Vatican mostly dealt with the European nations in concordat and civil agreements and our ambassadors, and mostly dealt with the Latin American countries of South America. But she now has civil agreements with most nations of the world. Some of these agreements of old still continue, like the agreement, concordat, that was hammered out and recognized in law between Pope Pius XII and Hitler, signed on July the 20th, 1933, where the Vatican gave its approval to the Nazi regime and never went back on her agreement, though millions of Jews suffered and millions of others. She gave her approval to the Nazis, and they approved of her law, and even things of money coming to the Vatican through civil agreements. And then Hitler was Catholic, and so were all the main men in his deadly machine.